I'm Justin Jennings, the ROM's curator for our presentation of Winnie the Pooh exploring a classic that's currently on display in the Roloff Benny Gallery on level 4. Delighted that you could come join us today for the Curator Conversations, where it's a new series that we explore different themes with and subjects from ROM's collections exhibitions. What you're going to experience today is a pre-recorded conversation between myself and Lindsay Mattick. Lindsay's a co-founder and creative director of the award-winning Toronto-based public relations firm Pomp and Circumstance. And more importantly for today, the great granddaughter of Captain Harry Colebourn, the real-life soldier who brought Winnie the Black Bear to the London Zoo. So welcome, Lindsay, for joining us.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
And so Lindsay has written 2 books on Winnie. She's going to talk a little bit about her story and her family story today. And I wanted to mention before we begin, of course, this is all stemming from our Winnie the Pooh Exploring the Classic exhibit organized by the V&A in London that features interactive, larger-than-life displays about Winnie the Pooh, the character, and people can delight in the characters, roam around the 100-acre woods, and enjoy his magical world for a while. But importantly for us today is that the ROM added a part on the real Winnie, the Canadian component, about that bear. And that's the story that we're going to really talk about today. And because that story begins, especially because that story begins in Ontario, I think it's important to acknowledge that the ROM sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Mississauga of the Credit First Nation nations. And so how we're going to work, how it's all going to work today is that we're going to go ahead and show this pre-recorded Q&A that I had with Lindsay. And then after we're done, we'll have a Q&A and answer some of your questions. Oh, Lindsay, it's so wonderful to have you with us today. And one thing that really excites me was just sort of your personal backstory as the great granddaughter of Harry Colebourn, and getting excited, writing some of the books, gathering your family's archives, getting into the museum, exhibit stuff. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about that personal journey to get you to where you are today.
Sure. So I always sort of say that the story of my great grandfather and Winnie Winnipeg the bear is a story that has obviously been in my family since I was a little kid, and I think I really first started exploring it a little bit more formally coming out of journalism school. I did a radio documentary, and I kind of realized that there was less and less people who would be available to actually talk to me about my great grandfather and this kind of unbelievable historic journey that he took, of course, with this little bear that became very famous and, of course, inspired Winnie the Pooh. So I think I had done a radio documentary, and then I, somewhere along the line, decided that at some point I would have my own children, and that wouldn't it be an amazing way to sort of help get to share this family history with them if I wrote a children's book. So I wrote a children's book, and then, I was thrilled with the response of my children's book, Finding Winnie. And then from there, I think there was a lot more questions and a lot of, frankly, older kids who wanted to know more about the story and more about how it unfolded. And hence the novel that I co-wrote with Josh Greenhut several years later called Winnie's Great War. And along the way, I've been honored to have helped contribute to a couple of Canadian exhibitions that have put these pieces together. And I can't even tell you how much of it, this, Justin, but it's such a dream come true to see some of Harry's items as part of this unbelievable exhibition at the ROM.
Wonderful. And let's maybe talk a little bit about Harry's story here. Let's go back to 1914. He's on his way from Winnipeg off to fighting World War I with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and he gets off in White River, Ontario. Now that's not a big deal. Everyone's getting off. They've got to refuel the train or what have you. But then he comes back on. He comes back on with a bear. Now, walk us through that. Now, why the heck would somebody come back on a train with a bear?
Well, I'll do my best because I wasn't there. But so I think this part of the story has always, it's definitely the part of the story that it's the beginning of the story. It's the part that where your kind of imagination jumps in and all kinds of, there's all kinds of questions like what exactly was he was he doing? And of course, we don't have any eyewitness accounts, but there's a few things that we do know. We know that number one, Harry was an animal lover. He grew up, his father managed a stable. So from the youngest of ages, he grew up around all kinds of animals. And we knew that he loved animals. And that's why he decided to become a veterinarian. That's why when he emigrated to Canada, he went to the University of Guelph, studied veterinary medicine, worked for the Department of Agriculture in Winnipeg. And then of course, when the First World War broke out, he enlisted. So we know that love of animals was very, natural for Harry. And we also know that mascots played a huge role in, throughout history, throughout wars. All kinds of animals have become mascots. There's amazing stories about pigs and donkeys and monkeys. There's another great Canadian tale about which I talk about actually in my book, Winnie's Great War, about a goat, Sergeant Bill from Saskatchewan, that was a mascot, who actually received 3 medals of honor because goats apparently have very, very good hearing. And the goat actually pushed several soldiers into a trench, saving them before a shell exploded. So we know that mascots have played a role. They sort of are a bit of a pet, if you will, for the soldiers. I think obviously going off to war would have been a very frightening experience. And so I think the same way that if you had a dog at home, it would be a source of love and a source of joy. I think that Harry must have thought that this little bear cub who was there, obviously from a hunter, a trapper that was selling her, had killed its mother and that was selling the cub. And I think that Harry must have thought, this is a moment to sort of have our Fort Garry horse, which was his regiment. This was the mascot that he could bring. And of course he named her Winnipeg after the Canadian city that he was from. And I think he must have, Winnie for short. And we can sort of deduce that he did that as a gesture to make his fellow soldiers, remind them of something close to home. So I think I wasn't there on the platform that day over 100 years ago, but that's my sort of my best take on it.
Wonderful, thank you. I like to imagine the soldiers' as Winnie comes on board. But let's keep on going on that journey, because we're in White River, Ontario. Winnie and Harry are on the train. They end up in Valcartier in Quebec, do some training. Of course, this is when Winnie is so infectious that a lot of the troops fall in love with her, and that's always the big thing, right? It's the girl bear, not the boy bear that has become.
Yes, big thing.
And so they go across on the Atlantic crossing with that big convoy, and they end up doing some training in England. But I think it's December of 1914, just before Harry ships off to France, he ends up loaning the bear to the London Zoo, and then at war's end, he ends up giving the bear to the zoo. So maybe once again, you were also not at the London Zoo, but you get some. Do you have perhaps some insights in why he chose to first loan the bear, and then at the end of the war, give the bear to the zoo?
For sure. So we know that he did arrive in England on the Salisbury Plain with his fellow Canadian soldiers. We know that it was a very tough fall for the soldiers. It was one of the wettest falls on record. So the Canadian soldiers, all the soldiers that were training there it was tough. The conditions were very tough. And of course, Winnie was just a cub at this point. And then as the months went on and December approached and the new year was approaching, Harry realized, of course, that he would be shipping out to go to the front lines in France in the new year. And so I think what must have been going through his mind, though again, I was not there, is that, the front lines was not going to be a place to bring a little bear cub. And I can only imagine that as, they began to get a fuller picture of what was happening, that sort of reality, some of the probably allure of this adventure that these young soldiers were on, some of those harsh realities of the conditions and what was going to be facing them, started to really probably crystallize. And so I think at that point, he probably decided, the front lines, this is not a good idea to take a small bear cub. Who knows how she was getting along with, the horses. Obviously the cavalry was a huge part of how the First World War was fought. But I think, he, for whatever reasons, he realized, she needs a new home. She's not coming to the front lines. So at that point, we know that on December the 9th, we know that he borrowed a car. I was always really curious about how did he physically get Winnie from the front lines, from Salisbury Plain to London, England, which was about an hour and a half drive. So he did have a car, and she was conceivably in the back seat. And basically, he had asked the London Zoo if they would keep Winnie for the duration of the war until he returned. And I think, there's lots of different accounts of how long people thought the First World War would go on for, but there's definitely many accounts that would suggest that people certainly didn't expect that it would go on for 4 years. And so, I think that along that way, whenever Harry had leave, and we know this because he would make notations in his diary, every time he had to leave from war, he would go to the London Zoo and he would visit Winnie. And I think over those 4 years, by the end, and I think, and this is one of the themes that we really explored in Winnie's Great War, but the theme of sacrifice, the theme of bravery and love. And I think that he had witnessed so much sacrifice over those 4 years that I think by the end, when he probably intended to bring her home, he realized that she had a new home. She was quickly becoming a star attraction at the London Zoo. She was, the children absolutely loved her. She became really quite well known as an attraction at the London Zoo for letting children ride on her back. She would do tricks. She had this amazing, really friendly nature. And I think at that point, he realized that he was not going to be able to just bring this bear cub back to Winnipeg. And that in fact, she had a new home. So, and again, we know that because on some of the photographs that Harry had sent home to family over the years, he had written on the back of those photographs that kind regards to all, someday Winnie will be coming home with me. So we do know there's some written intent there that he did plan to bring her back. But obviously the situation changed over those 4 years of the war.
Yeah, and then of course, when Christopher Robin is born in 1920, a few years later, he starts going to the zoo, and what's one of, I think probably the favorite animal there is, of course, Winnie, right? So that's where we get full circle. And of course, at the museum, and I should mention, we were the final stop for Winnie the Pooh's Great Tour, and we said, hey, let's bring it back. Let's actually show for us where the story began. For Canadians, it doesn't begin in London. It begins all the way back in White River, Ontario. So that's why we were so excited to have, you part of this exhibit and bringing some of those wonderful stories in that collection for the public to see. So it's been just great. So I got one last question for you, because of course, and you were there with me in early March. We had a great opening. We were very excited. And a week later, we had the close,
history.
We did the closing and ride us still riding all this epidemic stuff. But of course, the great thing is though we had to put the lights out on the 100-acre wood for a while, the lights are back on, and people are able to explore again. And so I wanted to talk a little bit to you about your own experiences in the walking through the exhibit. So I have two questions. First is, did you learn anything new in the exhibit, just walking through about, probably not so much about the real Winnie, but about Winnie the Pooh? And maybe if you could discuss an object or a drawing that really captured your attention while you were enjoying the
Sure. So I think I'll start off by just saying that, it truly was just an incredible day for me, for my family to see, our families, these items that have been in our family collection for so long at the ROM and as part of this amazing exhibition. So that just as a moment was pretty unbelievable. I think as well, just being able to see the way this exhibition was brought to life in such an imaginative way, as an author myself who had the opportunity obviously to collaborate with an illustrator, I think the exhibition did just such an unbelievable job at sort of bringing to life this creative collaboration and how Milne and Shepard worked together to create what have obviously become, some of the most beloved characters in history. And I think for me, you ask about sort of what did I learn and what did I enjoy? Well, one of the things that I learned that I thought was interesting was that Shepherd had actually used his own son, not Christopher Robin's bear, to help inform the drawings that he did of Winnie. So I didn't realize that. I knew that, of course, Milne really wanted Shepherd to draw Christopher Robin's stuffed animals, and those were the characters. But he had actually felt, for a few different reasons, that using his own son's bear for Winnie was, I guess, easier to sort of to draw him. So I thought that was interesting, and I particularly, because I love the characters so much in the stories. I really loved. There's a section of the exhibition, the character room, and I thought it was really, really interesting how just the physical attributes of the stuffed animals helped inform the actual personality traits of the characters. So as Milne and Shepherd collaborated, things like Eeyore's, the stuffed donkeys, his sort of crumpled, drooping neck ended up becoming a character point, which was that, of course, Eeyore was sort of sad and grumpy and a little bit depressed. And then, you have Piglet, which as a tiny little pig, as a stuffed animal, had a look of kind of mild surprise all the time, and that kind of became part of Piglet's anxious nature, and as the character unfolded. So I thought, to me, that was just so fascinating how, of course, there's always a collaboration between an author and an illustrator, and there's those personal experiences and personal moments that help inform your sort of where your reality meets the imagination of what you're creating. And I think that the exhibition did such a beautiful job of bringing that to life. And whether that was the character room, or even, there's a lot that's been written about the sort of natural world of Ashdown Forest, and how that helped inspire the 100 Acre Wood, and the adventures, of course, that all the characters would have, and the detail in Shepherd's drawings of the woods. And I felt that the exhibition did a really beautiful job of pulling that, kind of bringing that to life as well. So I can't wait to go back. It was, COVID shut us down, but I'm very excited to go back and be able to actually go through it again.
One of the questions that we had was, did Harry ever read the books? Did he ever meet Milne?
No, he did not meet Milne. We know that. Harry died in 1947, I believe. So it's a question that I've actually wondered quite a bit about. And to be perfectly honest, we don't know whether he ever read the books. Obviously, they were published in 1926, the first one, anyways. And so that definitely left several years. I don't know how popular they were in Canada. Obviously, they came out in the UK, and they, of course, did spread sort of far and wide. But to the best of my knowledge, I don't know for sure if he read the stories.
Okay, and so I have a couple of questions that I'll paraphrase together, because I think people are still struggling, as indeed I think everyone struggles. Okay, we have Winnie the Black Bear, and we have Winnie the Pooh, and the question is, how exactly did those sort of come together in terms of Winnie influencing perhaps the ways in which Winnie the Pooh was created and put on the page?
So I think that when I first started to kind of consider how my great-grandfather's pet, if you will, kind of made her way into the literary world that is Winnie the Pooh, I think, to be honest, at the beginning, I thought it was really just her name. It was the fact that Christopher Robin, of course, befriended this bear cub, Winnipeg Winnie, that was at the London Zoo and went frequently with his father, and his father, sort of borrowed Winnie's name. But the more that I kind of considered the question, and the sort of deeper I considered it, the more I started to really realize, and there's, of course, in the introduction to the first Winnie the Pooh book, there's an introduction where he talks about Christopher Robin going to the animal that he loved the most, which, of course, was Winnie. And I think that, given that the stories were about his son going on these adventures and befriending animals, inspired, of course, by his stuffed animals, which Winnie was named by, inspired by my great grandfather's bear. But really, what he witnessed, Milne, with his son Christopher Robin at the zoo, was a friendship between his son, a little boy, and a bear. And a bear is a wild animal, and despite the best efforts to train bears, most of the time you're not befriending them. I mean, you're just not. So I think that, to me, that's, I think, one of the things that's the most remarkable, and that I do think helped inspire the stories, is that, conceivably, as he was witnessing this unusual friendship where literally Christopher Robin was allowed to be inside her enclosure. And I think that couldn't help but have helped inspire the, of course, stories that he wrote about the stuffed animals and the friendships that he had with those animals.
Yeah, wonderful. And let me just add briefly to that, to what you were saying on the London side. So Christopher Robin was born in 1920. We said 1921 for his first birthday. His mother gets a bear stuffy from Harrods. And what's interesting, what plays into this thing is that, so before he even goes to the London Zoo, he has that bear. The bear has different names, but then what happens when he's about 3 or 4, and the timing's not exactly clear, he changes that bear's name to Winnie because of the relationship he has with the bear. So it's a sort of ongoing thing where the personality sort of is getting poured into the bear, in part because of his interactions with going to the zoo and seeing Winnie. So just sort of to add that element to that, it's sort of this interesting thing as you go on trying to track the changes in the bear's name and the personalities, is this sort of little side project that some people sometimes get involved in. And I guess I have a lot of questions, and this is a little bit further away, but it might be interesting to get your thoughts on it. So some people are asking, okay, so Winnie the Pooh was inspired in part by Winnie the black bear. Were there, and the question is, what about some of the other animals? Where did some of the other inspirations come from? Do you have any thoughts about that?
So unless there are stories that I'm not familiar with about, real life pigs or real life donkeys or rabbits, to the best of my knowledge, the other characters were based on Christopher Robin's stuffed animals. And again, sort of in the chat that Justin and I had and that you all just witnessed, I think that to me was one of the most fascinating pieces, was that as Milne and Shepard were bringing to life these stories, these physical attributes of these stuffed animals became character personality traits of the characters. And to me, that was really, really interesting. Like, whereas with Winnie, of course, Christopher Robin had renamed his stuffed bear from being Teddy and Edward to being named Winnie. But with the other characters, to the best of my knowledge, it was just simply that they were the stuffed animals that then turned into those characters. And to me, that was just so remarkable, that if it had been other stuffed animals that had different expressions or different looks in their eyes, the characters could have ended up being different than they were.
Yeah, and once again, to add another wrinkle to that, it's interesting because, for example, Milne introduces Owl. So Owl, there's no stuffy of Owl. And when he introduces, it's actually not based on any kind of stuff. It actually looks like an owl, so that when he does introduce, so the characters that are introduced into the 100 Acre Wood that are not based on Christopher Robin, he simply says, okay, I'm going to draw an owl. It's going to act like this and do like that. So there's a lot of, it's a very, I guess I would say is that there's a strong Canadian component here, but certainly there's a lot in the imagination that's going on between Milne and Shepard and Christopher Robin here. So another question we had to get back to your grandfather and the real Winnie stories here. Are there any memories that were shared about Winnie from members of your father's regiment or other fellow soldiers?
No. So I first started to understand this story through my grandfather. So my grandfather, Fred, who was Harry's only son. And that would have been when I was around sort of 7, 8 years old. Those are my sort of earliest memories of him, showing me the diary. And I've definitely had people over the years since, to be honest, my books have come out, and since there's been different exhibitions of people, kind of writing me emails and saying that I believe, my great grandfather was, was training, not necessarily in the same regiment, the Fort Garry Horse, but I have had emails from people whose great grandfathers were also part of the Canadian Armed Veterinary Corps that would have been training at the same time on Salisbury. And a couple of those have talked about, sort of sharing stories about Winnie. So that's been really interesting, is just kind of hear some of those stories that of course come out of the woodwork as you start to explore your family history.
All right, so to build off that, to continue focusing on Harry for a second, one of the questions is to maybe talk a little bit more about what prompted you, both what prompted you to write about your grandfather's adventures and how well it's been received sort of by the general public.
For sure. So I said this in the chat as well, but truly, ever since I can remember, I was pretty captivated by this history, by this story. I've always had a sort of natural interest in history, and I think to me, there was just this. It's one of those stories where if it wasn't my story, and it was someone else's story, and I heard it, you would kind of go, "Wow, one of the most beloved and famous fictional stories, Winnie the Pooh, was inspired by an equally remarkable true story about a Canadian soldier, of course, buying a bear cub." So I love stories, and the fact that this story happened to be my family story was really special to me. It's never been lost on me. The magic of that has never gone away. As much as I've been telling this story for a pretty long time now, the magic kind of never disappears. And I explored this story for the first time in a radio documentary after journalism school. And I really sort of got this idea that, again, telling my kids, I said, when at some point, I think I was 25, and I thought, at some point, one day in the future, I will probably have children. And wouldn't it be amazing if I could kind of tell this story in a way that would be a children's book? And so that was sort of the idea at the time. And as life does, you kind of go on, your own journeys to make those things happen. And eventually it, of course, did happen. And I started really getting serious when I found out I was pregnant with my son, my first child, in 2011. So it's been kind of a real labor of love, and a story that I've been very proud to share.
Wonderful. Yeah. So let me segue into a question I don't know the answer of. I'm curious if you do, which is, are there any descendants of the real Winnie out there?
Not that I'm aware of. We know that, no, I don't believe there are. I can say that pretty definitively. We do know that, Winnie as a bear, she was born in 1914, she died in 1934. So she lived for 20 years, which apparently is a pretty long time for a black bear. And yeah, but to the best of my knowledge, she never had any baby Winnies.
Okay, and another question I've gotten a few different versions of here is a fairly common question that you get, is why Pooh? Why they got the Winnie part, but why did Christopher Robin put the Pooh? And someone else had a question, why is it P-O-O-H versus P-O-O? I'm not sure if you have some of these, but there's a fascination here with the name and how it came. For sure.
No, and a legitimate fascination. So the way I understand it is that Pooh referred to apparently there was a swan. So I sort of always joke that somewhere out there's a great grandchild of the person who owned the swan, but I've never met that person. But apparently there was a swan that would shed its feathers, and the feathers would land on Christopher Robin's sleeve, and that the sound he made when he blew off the feathers from his sleeve was the sound Pooh. And apparently that's where the Pooh part comes from. So.
Yeah, so perhaps apocryphal, but yeah, that's certainly, we do know certainly that that he had, that was a name for a swan, and I would also say that the the, at least what I've heard, and Liz, you may have heard something different, but the idea of Winnie the Pooh is sort of like Alexander the Great, right? It's Winnie the Pooh. So
Yeah.
that's sort of that alliteration. But once again, a lot of these names, this was not a creation of Milne. This was a creation of Christopher Robin. The name was done by the boy. So you have to get into the head of a 4-year-old boy to understand why he did that. And then Milne just sort of worked with that and created those stories. So another question that I've gotten a few parts of is your thoughts about thoughts about Disney and the Disney adaptation of Pooh, and how it might be perhaps, well, I guess your thoughts on that in general, and then how it might be different from how you imagined from the original stories.
For sure. I'm such a fan of the Winnie the Pooh stories and the characters, and I feel that what Disney's been able to do in terms of taking the story to so many children and families around the world is amazing. So I believe that stories evolve. Stories that we told in one way 100 years ago, or in 1926 is different than how we tell stories in 2020. So I think that in whatever iterations these stories continue to be told and continue to bring the amazing themes of love and friendship and all of those things to young audiences is a really, really good thing.
Okay, so just a few more questions we'll have time for. One question here was, people say that real life Christopher Robin was not happy about the stories when he grew up, but that's just but the question is about Harry. What did Harry think about? Do you have any sense of what Harry thought about the stories?
That unfortunately is a big gap for me. When I first explored this my family story in a more formal way, when I did a radio documentary, and at that point I was trying to have conversations with as many people as I could in my family that would have had any firsthand relationship with Harry, to try to get as many facts and impressions as I could before those people were gone and I couldn't access it anymore. And it was very challenging. Again, to the best of my knowledge, he didn't, and I think sometimes it's hard for us to imagine in a 2020 context, because now with the internet and the way knowledge and information spreads, it's like, just because something's out in the UK or France or Germany, we know about it. We consume everything at the same time. And that obviously was not the case then. So as to the popularity of the stories, or somebody communicating that, it just wasn't something that, to the best of my knowledge, Harry was really aware that his pet had inspired this character. I don't know with any degree of certainty whether he knew that. It's a bit of a mystery to me. I certainly know that my grandfather, because when he really started to tell this story, was because I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but in the 1980s, there was a story that came out that Winnie the Bear belonged to a different Canadian regiment, an Edmonton-based regiment. And of course, that was not true. It was a Winnipeg-based regiment, and her name was, of course, Winnipeg, Winnie for short. And my grandfather at that point said, wait a second, and he was a very humble man, lived in Winnipeg, and he went, no, that was my dad's bear. I know that because my dad told me about Winnie growing up, and I have the diaries in the basement, and the diaries indicate that, of course, he had bought Bear for $20 and named her Winnie and visited her. And at that point, it became a huge international story that there was this Canadian connection to Winnie. And my grandfather at that point, Harry's son, Fred, he really explored it and it became celebrated. There was, of course, a statue unveiled in Winnipeg and in England. And at that point, the story and the Canadian connection really formalized. But everything prior to that was really sort of a bit of a question mark and a bit informal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. And I would just add to that, and it's talked a little bit in the show, is that when we talk about sort of legacy of Winnie the Pooh as the books, we often talk about sort of two pulses. One is that initial licensing agreement, which is the first of its kind, which you ended up with, games and tea sets, et cetera, in the 1930s, where you started seeing the first sort of push out of Winnie the Pooh as an idea. But I think to your point into whether or not your grandfather read it, the other thing that was I think it was around 1960, the first paperbacks began to come out, because Milne thought of himself as a serious author, and that doing a paperback was pretty much like Pulp Fiction. He was sort of against that for a long time. So what you also saw was this big push, in the late 50s, early 60s, where Pooh got new life because there were these cheap paperbacks are widely available. So it's amazing oftentimes when you see people coming in from a certain generation, they often have those original blue and white paperbacks, and we actually have some of those in the show. So it's interesting, these sort of moments where Pooh ebbs and flows depending on what's out there. So let me just we're running out of time here, and so let me just try to squeeze in two questions. I'll do one question quickly, which was it's a long thing, some issues about stamps, et cetera. And we've talked about some of the snippets of the story, but the guests here want to know if your book is in the curriculum in any schools in Canada.
It is. It's my book won the Caldecott Medal. Sophie Blackell, my illustrator, won for Finding Winnie in 2016, and that was an amazing thing because it I think got some more attention for the book than it otherwise would have had. And so it's actually in the curriculum in some Canadian schools for sure, but also it's been really amazing to see how many US schools are also, and this was a story that when I first was sharing the story, I couldn't believe. Definitely a lot of Canadians were familiar with the story that I would speak to, but virtually, very few Americans were aware of it. So it's been interesting to see where the book has sort of gone far and wide. And Winnie's Great War, which has been out for about 2 years, I know some schools for sure have been making it part of the curriculum.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, so let's we'll end the questions with the question on Winnie. So we'll end with the bear, which is probably the most appropriate. And the question was, how did Winnie change from a black girl bear to a brown boy bear?
Yeah, so much love for the gender issue with Winnie. It's very funny. But so as far as the color goes, so Christopher Robin again renamed his stuffed bear. His stuffed bear was called Teddy, and then it was Edward, and it was Big Bear at one point, and then he ultimately renamed the stuffed bear Winnie. That stuffed bear was a golden camel-colored bear, not a black bear like Winnie was. So that was the color. And when his stuffed animal, arguably without a gender, but as Milne and Shepard imagined him, the stuffed animal became a male character inspired by, of course, the real bear that was a female bear. So Winnie in my great-grandfather's bear was a female bear, black cub. The stuffed animal arguably was a male camel-colored bear. So that's what happened.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, and I should also bet the first colored versions were occurring. Shepard actually came back. I think it was about almost 30 years later, and when he did the first color versions, had to make that choice about what color. Milne at that point, I think, had either just passed away or was sick and about to pass away, and it was mainly Shepard that began to really drive in terms of the color versions. It's interesting as you go on is that the color of the bear has changed again slightly with Disney, so there's lots of interest. So it's not even so much a brown or a black bear, or the yellow bear,
True.
with the red shirt that didn't exist in the original. But thank you so much. This is wonderful. I should, a couple other questions that a number of people have asked in the Q&A. Is it still on? When is it closed? So let me end by answering those questions for you. After once again thanking Lindsay for this wonderful time. But Winnie the Pooh Exploring the Classic, it's open now. It runs through January 17th, so right into the new year. So you have a fair amount of time to go ahead and check out the exhibit too. I think it really is a wonderful time. We had a great time making, a great time exploring it. I'd love to have you there. And then also for all those interested in continuing these curator conversations, the next one is on October 7th. So please go to the ROM at Home and the ROM website. You can learn more about the next installment. So thanks everyone for joining us. And once again, thanks, Lindsay.